It was a humid Tuesday in July, the kind of day when the air clung to your skin like a bad decision. I was 54, a retired graphic designer living in the quiet cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek, a suburban neighborhood in Ohio that prided itself on manicured lawns and mailboxes painted in HOA-approved shades of beige. My name's Henry Caldwell, and I'd spent the last decade trying to blend into this place, keep my head down, mow my lawn on schedule, wave at neighbors whose names I barely remembered. But that morning, as I sipped black coffee in my kitchen, a letter slid under my door and changed everything. It wasn't a flyer for pizza or a coupon for gutter cleaning. It was heavy cardstock, no return address, just my name typed in crisp Arial font. I unfolded it, expecting a neighborly note or maybe a reminder about trash pickup. Instead, it was a cold, bureaucratic jab, per Section 3.1 of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association Landscaping Guidelines. Your pine trees exceed the height limit of 12 feet. Trim them by Friday or face daily fines of $100. No greeting, no signature, just the sterile venom of the HOA, delivered like a court summons. I read it twice, my coffee growing cold in my hand. Then I stepped into my backyard and looked up at my pines 13 feet tall, maybe a hair more, their branches swaying defiantly in the breeze. These weren't just trees. I planted them 15 years ago, after my father passed. Each one was a tribute, their roots mixed with his ashes, a living memorial to a man who'd taught me to question authority and fight for what mattered. The HOA didn't know that. To them, my trees were a violation, a blemish on their vision of suburban perfection. Willow Creek wasn't always like this. When I moved in, it was a place where kids rode bikes until dusk and neighbors swapped stories over beers. But 5 years ago, the HOA tightened its grip, led by Margaret Hensley, a woman whose voice could make a telemarketer sound warm. She'd turned our neighborhood into a grid of rules. Grass couldn't be taller than 3 inches. Fences had to be white vinyl, and trees couldn't dream too big. My pines, planted long before her reign, were now her latest target. I called the number at the bottom of the letter, hoping for a human with a shred of empathy. Margaret answered on the second ring. "This is Margaret Hensley, HOA president. How may I assist you briefly?" Her tone was a mix of corporate efficiency and thinly veiled disdain. I explained the tree's significance, how they honored my father, and how they weren't hurting anyone. She cut me off before I finished. "Section 3.1 is non-negotiable, Mr. Caldwell. Trees over 12 feet compromise visibility and aesthetic uniformity. It's a safety issue." "Safety?" I said, incredulous. "My backyard faces a drainage ditch. The only thing they're blocking is a view of mud." "Still a violation," she snapped. "Comply by Friday, or the fines begin." The line went dead before I could respond. That night, I sat on my porch, the moonlight filtering through the pines like a silver web. I thought of my dad, a man who'd once told me, "HOAs are just bullies with clipboards." He'd have laughed at this, then handed me a shovel to plant another tree out of spite. By morning, a second letter arrived, hand-delivered, upping the stakes, a $100 fine for noncompliance, with more to come daily. I tried the civilized route, wrote a letter requesting an exemption, attached photos of the trees, even offered to trim them slightly to preserve their spirit. 2 days later, the HOA's response was a typed rejection that might as well have said, "We don't care about your feelings." The escalation was swift and absurd. They sent landscapers to my property without warning, and I chased them off with a rake, feeling like a crazed hermit. They fined me for hostile behavior. I put up a sign in my yard, "Save the Pines," and they fined me for unauthorized signage. I started wondering if I should just sell the house and move, but that felt like surrender, and I don't surrender. One evening, while walking my dog, Rusty, a scrappy mutt with opinions, I ran into my neighbor, Carl Thompson. We'd known each other since high school, though he'd gone from class clown to electrician with a side gig as a conspiracy theorist. Over a beer on his porch, he leaned in, his eyes glinting. "This isn't about trees, Henry. The HOA's got bigger plans: control, conformity, turning us into cogs in their machine." I laughed, but he wasn't joking. "You know that HOA office?" he said, lowering his voice. "It's built right over a power line. The main one runs behind your lot, near the ditch." He grinned like he'd just handed me a winning lottery ticket. That night, an idea took root, petty, reckless, but irresistible. I didn't want to hurt anyone, just send a message, a disruption that said, You don't own me. I spend hours researching power grids, city records, and sketchy YouTube tutorials with titles like How to Mess with Electrical Lines and Not Die. My browser history probably flagged me for a dozen watch lists, but I was careful, driven by a quiet fury. Margaret and her rulebook had no right to erase my father's memory 1 inch of pine at a time. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. By the next week, the fines hit $800, and a final notice threatened legal action and city intervention to cut the trees. That Sunday, I laced up my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked to the edge of my yard where the power line hummed behind a tangle of brush. The transformer box loomed, its low buzz vibrating in my chest. I wasn't sure how far I'd go, but one thing was certain. My pines weren't coming down. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd picked the wrong backyard. The plan crystallized over sleepless nights. I wasn't an electrician, just a guy with a grudge and a caffeine habit, but the fantasy was vivid. Disrupt the HOA's power during their annual gala, a self-congratulatory extravaganza Margaret loved to flaunt. If I timed it right, their catered speeches and slideshows would collapse into chaos. To pull it off, I needed intel, which meant doing something that filled me with dread: attending an HOA meeting. I couldn't go as myself. After the rake incident and the sign, I was persona non grata. So, I became Walter Grayson, a prospective buyer curious about Willow Creek's governance. I dug out an old blazer, slapped on a cheap fake mustache that smelled like regret, and walked into the community clubhouse like I belonged. Margaret was at the podium, radiating self-importance, flanked by 2 board members. Paul, a nervous guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Lorraine, whose scowl matched her earrings. They were debating actual mulch, its shade, its texture, its vendors. I stifled a groan. Then Margaret mentioned the gala, Saturday night, outdoor venue, big lights, a digital slideshow, and a wine-tasting booth, all powered by the HOA's separate grid tied to the transformer behind my house. They'd even live-stream it for transparency. I smiled, slipped out, and called Carl. He was all in, his eyes lighting up like a kid planning a prank. "We're not cutting wires, right?" he asked. "Just a time disconnect, lights out." "Panic. You look innocent. Pines stay." He showed me the junction behind my lot, buried under a maintenance panel. With a timer rig, we could trigger an outage 30 minutes into the gala, letting Margaret bask in her glory before I yanked the plug. I spent the week preparing mapping escape routes, buying a headlamp, and practicing stealth in my backyard. Rusty gave me side-eye, sensing trouble. Friday night, I played normal, waved at Lorraine as she walked her poodle, faked a Zoom call, and mowed my lawn. At 11 p.m., under a moonless sky, I crept out in black clothes, Carl's tool bag over my shoulder. The panel was cold, my hands shaky with adrenaline. I wasn't breaking anything, just balancing the scales. The HOA had threatened them with fines and threats. I was the correction. I wired Carl's timer to the switch, set it for 30 minutes into the gala, and slipped home, my heart pounding. What if it failed? What if it worked too well? I pushed the doubts down. This was about defiance, not destruction. Saturday arrived like a storm cloud, heavy with anticipation. I sat in my living room, flipping through TV channels, game shows, reruns, infomercials, anything to distract from the countdown in my head. My dog, Rusty, sprawled on the rug, sensing my nerves and shooting me occasional glances that said, "You're in over your head, pal." By 7:30 p.m., I couldn't sit still. I logged into the HOA's live stream, the feed glowing on my laptop like a window into enemy territory. The gala was in full swing at Willow Creek's outdoor pavilion, a half-mile from my house. White tablecloths gleamed under string lights, crystal vases held tasteful lilies, and neighbors milled about in khakis and sundresses, clutching wine glasses. Margaret Hensley stood center stage, her floral blazer crisp, her smile practiced. She raised a glass, addressing the crowd like a politician at a fundraiser. Behind her, a massive screen cycled through a PowerPoint about community excellence. I checked my phone, 7:55 p.m. 2 minutes to go. My heart thumped as I pictured the transformer behind my lot, Carl's timer ticking down. I'd wired it last night, double-checked every connection, but doubt gnawed at me. What if it didn't work? What if it caused a fire or blacked out the whole neighborhood? I wasn't a criminal, just a guy pushed too far, trying to save his father's trees from Margaret's clipboard tyranny. At 7:56, Margaret's voice boomed through the stream. With your support, Willow Creek will remain the safest, most orderly community in the county. 7:57. The lights flickered. Then darkness. Screams erupted sharp, panicked. A wine glass shattered. The live stream cut to black, but not before someone shouted, "Is this a power surge?" The HOA's logo flashed, distorted, then vanished. I froze, my breath caught. It worked. No explosions, no sirens, just pure, glorious chaos. I leaned back on my couch, a grin creeping across my face. Somewhere, Margaret was probably clutching her pearls, demanding someone fix her perfect night. I raised my coffee mug to the pines outside, their silhouettes swaying in the dark. "This one's for you, Dad." The high didn't last. By morning, guilt crept in, mingling with the adrenaline. I disrupted a community event, petty, sure, but technically illegal. What if someone had been hurt in the dark? I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, scanning for signs of suspicion. The neighborhood was quiet, the HOA's prized fountain gurgling like nothing had happened. I half expected police at my door, but there was nothing, just birds and the hum of a distant lawnmower. Carl swung by at noon, a six-pack of beer under his arm and a grin that could light up a blackout. "Cleanest hit I've ever seen," he said, flopping into a patio chair. "You knocked out their whole gala." Lorraine tripped over a table, and someone knocked over the dessert cart. There are blurry photos online, pure gold. We clinked bottles, laughing too loud, the kind of laugh that comes from dodging a bullet. But even in that moment, I knew the HOA wouldn't let this slide. Margaret didn't strike me as the type to shrug off humiliation. By Monday, the retaliation began. Flyers appeared on every mailbox and lamppost. Investigation underway. Power disruption at annual gala. The notice claimed the police were involved and offered a 6-month HOA fee waiver for information leading to the culprit. My stomach churned. That was real money, thousands of dollars. I had neighbors who'd sell out their kids for less. I doubled down on blending in. No extra trash, no yard decorations, just Henry Caldwell, model citizen with slightly tall pines. Margaret took the investigation personally. She patrolled the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, her eyes narrowed like a hawk hunting prey. One afternoon, she stopped by while I was trimming my hedge, a chore I'd faked to look busy. "Henry," she said, her voice sharp as a tack, "did you notice any power issues Saturday night?" I wiped fake sweat from my brow. "Not really. Was there an outage?" "The entire pavilion lost power," she said, studying me. "You didn't hear generators or see patrol lights?" I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Thought it was just mood lighting, you know, for the vibe." Her lips pursed, and she scribbled something on her clipboard before moving on to grill the Wilsons about their mailbox height. I exhaled, but the encounter left me rattled. She didn't have proof, but she had suspicion, and that was dangerous enough. The neighborhood forum, usually a sleepy corner of the internet filled with lost pet posts and recipe swaps, exploded with paranoia. Some blamed a faulty transformer, others a cyber attack. One guy, Gary, insisted it was Russian hackers and spammed links to articles about EMPs. No one mentioned sabotage. No one mentioned me. But something else was happening, a shift I hadn't anticipated. The gala fiasco had exposed the HOA's incompetence, and people were pushing back. It started small. Someone left their trash bins out an extra day. Another neighbor planted a gaudy gnome in their yard, and no one removed it, even after Margaret's second warning letter. A teenager spray painted a smiley face on a stop sign, and instead of outrage, neighbors chuckled. It was like the blackout had cracked the HOA's armor, and the community was testing the fault lines. Paul, the HOA's jittery vice president, tried to keep order, knocking on doors but bolting if anyone answered. He had the energy of a man allergic to confrontation, caught between Margaret's demands and a neighborhood starting to wake up. Carl was thrilled, calling it the Power Rebellion. He wanted to print t-shirts, but I shut that down fast. "We made our point," I said. "Let's not tempt fate." Deep down, though, I felt the tide turning. Neighbors smiled more, lingered in driveways, and swapped stories instead of HOA complaints. Then, a bombshell landed. A letter, cream-colored, no return address, just my name in neat handwriting. Inside, a single line, "I don't know what happened Saturday, but thank you. A friend." I stared at it, my pulse racing. Was it genuine? A trap? I tucked it into my kitchen drawer, next to Margaret's violation notices. Whoever wrote it saw through the chaos, and that meant I wasn't alone. The thought was thrilling and terrifying. I'd gone from a guy fighting for his trees to a spark in a brewing uprising. The stakes were climbing, and if I wasn't careful, I could go from folk hero to felon in a heartbeat. The HOA doubled down, plastering the neighborhood with new flyers. Community Integrity Emergency Meeting, Friday night. The headline was dystopian, laminated like they expected a riot. Margaret was losing her grip, and nothing scared her more than a community that wasn't afraid. Paul was spotted pacing the block, clipboard shaking in his hands, collecting feedback, but fleeing at the first sign of real questions. Lorraine reverted to scolding kids for skateboarding, as if that would restore order. I stayed on my porch, sipping coffee, watching their empire fray. Something else changed, too. Neighbors started talking. Not just waves or small talk, but huddles in driveways, whispers over fences. The blackout had forced people to look up from their routines and see each other. No HOA pamphlets, no performance, just stories shared in the dark. It was the kind of connection Willow Creek hadn't had in years, and it felt like a gift I hadn't meant to give. Then Carl called, his voice electric. "You won't believe this. Margaret's HOA emails got leaked." My jaw dropped. "Leaked how?" "Someone posted screenshots on the forum," he said. "Deleted fast, but I saved copies. It's bad, Henry. Embezzlement, hidden fines, and personal expenses. She used HOA funds for a wine cooler in her office." I blinked, processing. The woman who'd fined me for a bird feeder was chilling Chardonnay on our dime. "It gets worse," Carl added. "She funneled maintenance contracts to her brother's company, charging triple the rate and pocketing the rest." I was stunned, but not surprised. Margaret had built a petty empire, cloaked in bylaws and blazers, and no one had questioned it until now. The emergency meeting was 2 days away, and the leaked emails were spreading like wildfire. I didn't know who'd posted them or why, but they'd lit a fuse. The question was whether the neighborhood would stay quiet or blow the whole thing wide open. Friday loomed, and I felt the weight of what I'd started. The blackout wasn't just about my Pines Anna Maria, it was about power, who wielded it, and who dared to fight back. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next, but as I looked at my trees, their branches catching the sunset, I knew one thing. I'd gone too far to turn back. Friday night arrived like a courtroom showdown, the air thick with anticipation. The Willow Creek clubhouse was packed, folding chairs spilling into the aisles, neighbors crowding the windows to catch a glimpse of the chaos. I stood near the back, blending into the sea of khakis and cardigans, my heart pounding like a drum. The HOA's Community Integrity Emergency Meeting wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning, and everyone knew it. The leaked emails exposing Margaret Hensley's corruption had spread faster than a summer wildfire, and the neighborhood was ready to ignite. Margaret stood at the front, her usual poise fraying at the edges. Her floral blazer was crisp, but her face was pale, her hands clutching the podium like a lifeline. Paul sat beside her, sweating through his polo shirt, his eyes darting as if he expected a riot. Lorraine gripped her purse, her scowl deeper than ever, like she was daring someone to make a move. The room buzzed with tension whispers, shuffled feet. The rustle of printed emails passed like contraband. I'd seen one earlier. Margaret's digital signature on orders for a $3,000 wine cooler, paid with HOA funds, and a contract funneling maintenance work to her brother's company at triple the market rate. It was damning, and the crowd knew it. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice cracking as she tried to reclaim control. "Good evening, residents. We're here to address recent concerns and reaffirm our commitment to transparency." The word transparency landed like a bad punchline. A hand shot up from the back, then another, then a third. Questions came fast, sharp, and unrelenting. Where are the financial reports from the last 3 years? Why are we paying $15,000 for landscaping when the going rate is $5,000? Who approved Italian marble for the clubhouse bathroom? Margaret fumbled, her answers vague, deflect, redirect, repeat. But the crowd wasn't having it. A woman in the front row, Ellen Harper, a retired accountant who'd never spoken at a meeting, pulled out her phone and read an email aloud, complete with timestamps and Margaret's signature. "This shows you diverted $20,000 of our dues to your brother's firm for consulting. Care to explain?" The room erupted gasps, murmurs, a few shouts. Someone handed out more printed emails, and they spread like revolutionary pamphlets. Paul tried to intervene, his voice shaky. These documents haven't been verified, but Ellen cut him off, holding up another email. This one's verified, Paul. It's got your signature, too, approving the wine cooler. The crowd roared, and Paul sank into his chair, looking like he wanted to disappear. Lorraine stayed silent, her purse now a shield against the mob. Margaret's eyes darted, searching for an ally, but none came. Then came the moment that changed everything. Mr. Randall, a retired judge who'd lived in Willow Creek for 30 years and rarely spoke, stood up. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a gavel. I move for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board, effective immediately. The room went still, then exploded with agreement. Hands shot up to Zen's, then more, a wave of defiance. Someone seconded the motion, loud and clear. Margaret didn't argue. She stood frozen, her empire crumbling in real time. A slow clap started in the back, spreading until it echoed off the walls. Margaret grabbed her purse and walked out, her heels clicking on the tile. No one stopped her. No one offered comfort. Even Lorraine looked away, distancing herself from the wreckage. The meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors shouting, laughing, some stunned, others exhilarated. I slipped out to the parking lot, my mind reeling. Margaret was gone, dethroned in under an hour. The Queen of Willow Creek had fallen, and I'd lit the match. Outside, the night was cool, the stars sharp against a black sky. Carl found me near the vending machine, his grin wide enough to split his face. "Revolution's a hell of a drug, huh?" he said, clapping my shoulder. I didn't think it'd happen this fast. Neither did I admitted. But it's not over. They'll regroup, or someone else will step up. Carl shrugged. Maybe. But for now, we won. Your pines are safe. He raised an imaginary glass, and I laughed, but the victory felt fragile. I'd wanted to save my trees, not topple an institution. What came next? A power vacuum? New rules? I drove home, the anonymous letter from my drawer heavy in my thoughts. You're not alone. Someone had seen my hand in this, and that made me both proud and paranoid. The next few days were surreal. Willow Creek didn't collapse, it thrived. Kids rode bikes past dusk, their laughter echoing down the street. Neighbors set up folding tables for impromptu barbecues, swapping burgers and stories. A group formed to create a new community circle, a democratic replacement for the HOA. They asked me to join, but I declined. I wasn't a leader, I was the guy who'd flipped a switch and watched the dominoes fall. Carl, to everyone's surprise, was nominated to lead the new group. He accepted, promising to ditch fines and replace the HOA newsletter with monthly potlucks. At the first community circle gathering, I stood under my pines, sipping lemonade and watching neighbors mingle. No one mentioned tree height or mailbox colors. They talked about kids, jobs, life, real things. It was messy, human, and exactly what I'd fought for. But as Carl raised a toast to a new Willow Creek, I noticed Margaret's house across the street. It was dark, no lights, no movement. 3 days later, a for sale sign appeared. She'd left without a word, her legacy reduced to a punchline. I kept her violation letters in my drawer, next to the anonymous note, reading them occasionally to remind myself how fast power could crumble. But the peace was short-lived. A week later, another letter arrived, tucked between junk mail. No envelope, just my name in the same neat handwriting. I know what you did, and thank you. My breath caught. This wasn't a one-off. Someone was watching, not to expose me, but to cheer me on. It made the victory sweeter and the stakes higher. The neighborhood kept changing. Someone painted their garage with a mural of daisies, and no one complained. Lorraine, of all people, complimented it, though she called it bold. Block parties popped up, kids drew chalk murals on sidewalks, and a guy named Tom built a birdhouse shaped like the old HOA office, complete with a tiny eviction notice sign. It was petty and perfect. The community circle meetings were chaotic open forums in the park, no clipboards, just donuts and a karaoke mic. People argued about lawn art or noise, but no one called the cops. It was progress. Not everyone was on board. A small group of HOA loyalists, led by a guy named Roger, started whispering about forming a new association. They tossed around words like order and property values, meeting in garages to draft bylaws. When they pitched their plan at a community circle meeting, the crowd laughed them off. Someone asked if they'd include wine coolers in the budget. Another offered to sell them a rulebook with the pages glued shut. The proposal died quietly, but it was a reminder. The fight for freedom wasn't over. Carl was in his element, mediating disputes with handshakes instead of fines. When a neighbor turned his yard into a loud skate park, Carl negotiated a deal: smaller ramps, quieter hours, and the kid helped with park cleanup. When another resident started renting out goats from her driveway, yes, goats, Carl allowed weekend visits if they wore name tags. It was absurd, but it worked. Willow Creek was finding its balance, and my pine stood untouched, a quiet symbol of the rebellion. One evening, as I sat under the trees, a breeze rustling their branches, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a community remembering that it could say no. But the second anonymous note stayed with me, a puzzle I couldn't solve. Carl thought it was Mrs. Larson, a 70-year-old widow who walked her cat, and claimed she'd been a spy in the 60s. I didn't push it. Not knowing made it bigger, like my actions had rippled beyond my backyard. Then came a new threat. A letter from the county arrived, clipped to a legal notice. They were inspecting the power grid behind my property, specifically the transformer I'd tampered with, due to a formal complaint. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the HOA, it was bigger, official. Rusty tilted his head as I read the notice aloud, his eyes saying, "Told you so." I called Carl, who went quiet, then muttered about fines, lawsuits, maybe worse. We checked the transformer that night, flashlights off, hearts racing. Everything looked normal, no loose wires, no scorch marks. But that didn't mean they wouldn't find something. The inspection was scheduled for Tuesday, and I spent the weekend in a fog of dread. Had I left a trace? Would Margaret's departure make me a scapegoat? The pines stood tall, but I wondered if they'd cost me more than I'd bargained for. The county's letter sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Infrastructure review due to a formal complaint. Inspection of the power grid behind your property, specifically the transformer station, is scheduled for Tuesday, 9 a.m. I read it so many times that the words blurred, each syllable tightening the knot in my chest. This wasn't Margaret Hensley's petty fines or the HOA's laminated threats. This was the county government, bureaucracy, consequences that could stretch beyond my pines to my savings, my home, maybe my freedom. Rusty, my mutt, sprawled on the floor, his eyes fixed on me like he knew I'd rolled the dice and lost. I called Carl that night, my voice low, the words spilling out. They're inspecting the transformer. A formal complaint. What if they find something? Carl, usually quick with a quip, went silent for a beat too long. Worst case, he said finally, fines, maybe a lawsuit. If they prove tampering, could be criminal charges. His attempt at calm only made it worse. But we were careful, right? No loose ends. I thought so, I said, pacing. But what if I missed something? A fingerprint, a tool mark? My mind raced, replaying that moonless night, me in black clothes, hands trembling as I wired Carl's timer to the switch. I'd been meticulous, or so I thought. Now, every decision felt like a trap closing around me. We met at midnight behind my lot, flashlights off, the transformer's hum cutting through the silence. The panel looked untouched, no scorch marks, no dangling wires, no signs of my handiwork. Carl checked the connections, his face lit by the faint glow of his phone. "Looks clean," he whispered. "But if they bring forensics, we're screwed." He was half joking, but the word forensics lodged in my brain like a splinter. I went home and didn't sleep, my ceiling fan spinning in time with my spiraling thoughts. Tuesday morning, I was a wreck, gulping coffee and peering through my blinds like a fugitive. At 9 a.m., two men in neon vests and hard hats pulled up in a county van. They nodded politely as I stepped outside, forcing a neighborly wave. "Just routine," one said, clipboard in hand. "Won't take long." They walked to the transformer, their boots crunching on gravel, and I retreated inside, pretending to sip coffee while my heart hammered. Every glance they exchanged, every note they jotted, felt like a verdict. Were they measuring voltage? Checking for tampering? Sniffing out my guilt? They left after 20 minutes. No questions, no accusations. I watched their van disappear, my knees weak. Relief should have hit, but instead, I felt exposed, like a kid who dodged a teacher's glare but knew the test wasn't over. 3 days later, a final letter arrived. No violations detected. Grid intact and safe. No further action required. I collapsed onto my couch, the paper trembling in my hands. Rusty barked once, then went back to his tennis ball, unimpressed by my emotional roller coaster. I dodged the bullet, but the scare left scars. I couldn't keep living like a vigilante hiding in plain sight. Willow Creek, meanwhile, was blooming. The community circle, led by Carl, replaced the HOA's iron fist with open forums and potlucks. Neighbors painted fences bright colors, planted wildflowers, and left lawnmowers idle without fear of fines. Kids turned sidewalks into chalk galleries, and someone installed a little library in an old mailbox, stuffed with paperbacks and notes. It was messy gloriously so, but not everyone played nice. A guy named Derek turned his backyard into a skate park, blaring music every Saturday morning. Another neighbor, Sheila, started a goat rental business, her driveway a petting zoo that baffled half the block. Carl handled it with a mix of charm and compromise. Derek's skate park was scaled down, and he joined the park cleanup crew. Sheila's goats got weekend passes, provided they wore sweaters with name tags, a rule so absurd it became a neighborhood joke. These weren't bylaws. They were handshakes, and they worked. My pines stood untouched, their height a non-issue, their branches a quiet testament to the rebellion. I spent evenings under them, the breeze like a friend whispering, "You did this." But the anonymous notes haunted me. The second one, "I know what you did, and thank you," sat in my drawer, its handwriting identical to the first. Who was watching? Why not reveal themselves? Carl was obsessed, convinced it was Mrs. Larson, the cat-walking widow with a Cold War spy story. "She's got motive," he said over beers one night. "Hates the HOA, loves chaos." I shrugged, but the mystery gnawed. It meant my blackout wasn't just a prank, it had resonated, maybe inspired others. That was thrilling, but it also painted a target on my back. The neighborhood's new freedom brought growing pains. Roger's group of HOA loyalists kept pushing for a new association, their meetings now open but poorly attended. At one community circle forum, Roger stood up, waving a draft of the bylaws. "We need structure," he said. "Property values depend on order." The crowd groaned. Someone yelled, "Order got us a $3,000 wine cooler." Another offered to trade him a rulebook for a goat. Roger sat down, red-faced, his plan dead on arrival. But his persistence was a warning. Not everyone wanted this new, looser Willow Creek. Then I did something reckless. I offered to host the next community circle gathering, no agenda, just food, music, and a projector for old movies. It was my way of stepping out of the shadows, proving I was part of this community, not just its secret saboteur. Carl loved the idea, and the circle approved it unanimously. 6 months ago, I was the guy fined for a shrub 2 inches too wide. Now, I was printing flyers that said, "Free popcorn, bring a lawn chair." The night of the event was imperfectly perfect. The wind knocked over the drink table twice, and the projector refused to sync with the speakers, but the turnout was huge. Families sprawled on blankets, kids chased fireflies, and adults swapped stories over lemonade. Paul brought chips and dip, looking relaxed for the first time in years. Lorraine showed up with lemon bars, even complimenting a neighbor's off-key karaoke. I stood near my pines, watching it unfold, a warmth spreading in my chest. This wasn't survival, it was healing. Near the end, Carl climbed onto a picnic table, tapping a spoon against his beer bottle. "Before this projector dies," he said, "I want to say something. This year's been wild blackouts, goat wars, an illegal pig roast I wasn't at." Laughter rippled through the crowd, including from Tom, who'd hosted said roast. "But we're talking again, helping each other, not hiding." And that started because one person, nameless, reminded us the system doesn't need a reboot. It needs a blackout. The crowd clapped, and a few heads turned my way, not accusing, but knowing, like they'd pieced it together and decided it was okay. Maybe even heroic. After the chairs were folded and the projector packed, Carl and I sat on the grass, staring at a moonless sky. "You ever gonna tell me who sent those notes?" he asked. "Does it matter?" I said. "Probably not." We sat in silence, crickets humming. Then he grinned. "You could run for circle leader, you know. You'd win." "I'd rather eat a lawnmower," I said, and we laughed, the sound carrying into the night. A week later, the old HOA office vacant since Margaret's exit got a new sign: Willow Creek Community Hub, Library, Event Space, Free Coffee Fridays. I walked in on opening day and froze. Behind the desk, framed like a trophy, was a laminated HOA notice. Per section 3.1, your pine trees exceed the height limit. Below it, in red marker, and they're still growing. I laughed so hard I had to sit down, tears stinging my eyes. Someone, maybe my anonymous friend, had turned my fight into a monument. But the past wasn't done with me. One morning, a third note appeared, taped to my door. You gave us back our home. Thank you. Same handwriting, same mystery. I stared at it, a mix of pride and unease. My actions had changed Willow Creek, but they'd also left a trail. How many knew? How long could I stay in the clear? The pines stood tall, their shadows long, but I wondered if the real storm was still coming. The third anonymous note, you gave us back our home. Thank you, sat in my kitchen drawer, a quiet ember that could either warm or burn. At 54, I'd never imagined myself as the spark of a suburban revolution. Yet here I was, Henry Caldwell, the guy who'd flipped a switch and toppled an HOA empire. Willow Creek was unrecognizable from the sterile grid it had been 6 months ago. Kids painted sidewalks with chalk dragons, neighbors hosted potlucks without permits, and my pines 13 feet and defiant stood untouched, their branches whispering victory in the breeze. But that note, the third in a series, kept me on edge. Someone knew my secret, and while their words were grateful, knowledge was power, and power could shift. I tried to focus on the present. The community circle, under Carl Thompson's chaotic but earnest leadership, had turned Willow Creek into a place where people mattered more than bylaws. The old HOA office, now the community hub, buzzed with book swaps, knitting clubs, and free coffee Fridays that drew crowds. Lorraine, once Margaret Hensley's scowling enforcer, joined a gardening group, her lemon bars now a meeting staple. Paul, the nervous ex-VP, started coaching kids soccer, his clipboard replaced by a whistle. Even Roger's band of HOA loyalists fizzled, their last meeting drawing only 3 people, one of whom left early for a barbecue. But the notes gnawed at me. Who was my ally? Why stay hidden? Carl, ever the theorist, stuck to his Mrs. Larson hypothesis, citing her cat leash and cryptic smiles. She's playing 4D chess, he said one evening, cracking a beer under my pines. Bet she's got a file on everyone. I laughed, but the mystery felt heavier with each note. They weren't threats, but they were proof my blackout hadn't gone unnoticed. How many others had guessed? Would they stay silent? The county inspection had cleared me, but the scare lingered like a bruise. I'd tampered with a power grid, petty in intent, but illegal. If someone connected the dots, my pines might survive, but my life could unravel. Still, I couldn't regret it. The blackout had freed Willow Creek, not just from Margaret's tyranny, but from the fear that had kept neighbors strangers. Driveways became gathering spots. Mailboxes held thank you cards instead of fines, and the air felt lighter, like a belt unbuckled after a long day. One morning, as I grabbed my mail, a kid maybe 10, with a mop of brown hair stood under my tallest pine, staring up like it was a monument. "Did you plant this?" he asked, his voice curious. "Yeah," I said, pausing by the mailbox. "Why so tall?" I smiled, the answer coming easily. "Because no one told it not to be." He nodded, like that made perfect sense, and ran off to join his friends. I watched him go, a warmth spreading in my chest. That was the Willow Creek I'd fought for, a place where kids could ask questions, where trees could grow without rulers. But the past wasn't done with me. A week after the third note, a final letter arrived, tucked in my mailbox with no stamp, just my name in that familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "Meet me at the community hub, Friday, 7 p.m. I think it's time we talked." A friend. My stomach flipped. This wasn't gratitude, it was a summons. Was it a trap? A confession? I spent 2 days debating, Rusty's skeptical glances no help. Carl urged me to go. "If it's a setup, I'll be your backup," he said, half serious. "If it's real, you need to know who's in your corner." Friday night, I walked to the hub, the old HOA office, now a cozy space with mismatched chairs and a coffee maker that never stopped. The room was empty except for one person, Ellen Harper, the retired accountant who'd read Margaret's emails aloud at the emergency meeting. She was 62, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, sitting at a table with 2 mugs of coffee. "Henry," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I figured you'd show." I sat, wary. "You wrote the notes?" She nodded, sipping her coffee. "I saw what you did or guessed it. The gala blackout, the timing, your trees. It added up." I didn't have proof, but I didn't need it. You gave us a chance to fight back. Why not say something sooner? I asked, my voice tight. Why the secrecy? Ellen leaned back, her gaze steady. I wasn't sure you'd want it known. People like heroes, but they also like scapegoats. I waited to see if you'd keep pushing or fade out. You didn't fade. That gathering you hosted? It showed you're in this for the community, not just yourself. I exhaled, relief mixing with unease. You could have turned me in. The county was sniffing around. Turn you in? She laughed softly. Henry, I was cheering you on. Margaret bled us dry for years' fines, contracts, that ridiculous wine cooler. You cracked her armor. The emails I read, I got them from a friend who hacked the HOA server after your blackout. You inspired that. I blinked, processing. My prank had sparked a chain reaction. Ellen's friend. The leaks, the rebellion. So what now? I asked. You know I broke the law. What's to stop someone else from figuring it out? Nothing, she said plainly. But look around. This place isn't about snitching anymore. It's about trust. You earned that. Keep earning it, and no one's digging up your secrets. She slid a mug toward me. Deal. I took the coffee, my hand steadier. Deal. We talked for an hour about the Pines, my dad, her years crunching numbers and spotting fraud. Ellen wasn't a spy, just a woman tired of bullies. When I left, the night felt clearer, the weight of the notes gone. I wasn't exposed, I was understood. Willow Creek kept growing. Derek's skate park became a community project, with kids painting the ramps. Sheila's goats got a permanent pen at the park, a hit with families. The community hub hosted movie nights, craft fairs, even a goat yoga class that Carl swore he'd never try again. Roger's loyalists gave up, some joining the circle, others moving away. Lorraine started a book club, her judgments now aimed at plot twists instead of mailboxes. Paul's soccer team won a local tournament, and he smiled more than I'd ever seen. I stayed in the background, attending circle meetings, but letting others lead. My Pines were a quiet legend, their height a badge of defiance. One evening, as I sat under them, a paper lantern floated above the park, lit by neighbors at a festival. It drifted high, its glow stubborn against the dusk. I watched it vanish, feeling rooted, at home in a way I hadn't since Dad died. A year later, the hub held an anniversary party for the community circle. Carl, now a seasoned leader, gave a speech, beer in hand. We're not perfect, he said, but we're us. No fines, no fear, just neighbors. And it started with a spark, someone who said enough. Here's to them. The crowd cheered, and a few eyes met mine, not accusing, but grateful. I raised my glass, my Pines behind me, their shadows long and steady. The final twist came that night. Ellen pulled me aside, handing me a small frame. Inside was the first HOA notice about my Pines, red marker scrawled beneath, and they're still growing. Thought you'd want this, she said. It's yours. I hung it in my living room, a reminder not of the fight, but of what it built, a community that chose freedom over control, connection over conformity. Willow Creek wasn't utopia. Arguments flared, lawns got messy, and Carl's potlucks sometimes ran out of ribs. But it was alive, human, ours. My Pines stood tall, their roots deep, like my dad's lessons. Question authority, fight for what matters, and never let someone else define your home. I'd broken the law, risked everything, but I'd do it again. Not for revenge, but for the people who'd become my family, the ones who'd stood with me, seen or unseen. As I write this, I'm 55, sipping coffee on my porch, rusty at my feet. The Pines sway, catching the sunrise. They're taller now, maybe 14 feet, and no one's measured. They don't need to. They're home.